Was a man who was shot to death by Bakersfield police at the 4 Point Sheraton acting as an informant and helping lead officers to an armed parolee? It's just one of several unanswered questions raised tonight by the family of Jorge Ramirez Jr., who was an unarmed passenger in a car fired upon by police. 17's Kiyoshi Tomono sat down with the family to talk about the shooting that the BPD refuses to talk about.
If the police put my son there, I wanted to come forward and let us know that that's what happened.
Jorge Ramirez admits his son, Jorge Jr., had his demons with drugs. His son was laid to rest earlier this week, but the family can't lay to rest a lingering question.
If that was the case, if my son was an informant.
10 days ago, Jorge Jr. was shot by police alongside the man here on the left side of your screen, 32-year-old Justin Brian Harger, who was wanted for an assault with a deadly weapon charge. Officers say Harger opened fire upon them, grazing one officer in the head. But tonight, Jorge Sr. wonders if his son was in Harger's SUV, acting as an informant and leading officers to Harger through a deal brokered with police.
I don't have anything in concrete to what happened, but this is why I'm seeking answers.
This document shows Ramirez Jr. had an open drug case following an arrest by the BPD in mid-August. Records also show Ramirez's court hearing on the charge was delayed for further investigation just 5 days before the shooting. In its official news release, the Bakersfield Police Department says Harger, who was a wanted parolee by the U.S. Marshal Service, was here in the area of the 4 Point Sheraton. But the BPD will not say how or where they received that information. It's one of 32 questions we sent to the BPD on Tuesday, some seeking basic information about what happened, like how many shots were fired and were officers aiming at Harger, at Ramirez, or at both. Police spokeswoman Michaela Beard sent us this response, saying the case is under investigation, and at this point, they're unable to provide answers to the questions we submitted. Even basic questions like, what is being investigated? Are officers under investigation? Or if one suspect had a gun, how did both come to be killed by officers?
For those who didn't know my son, they might criticize his past. We all have a past. We all have friends or family members that have their past, troubled past.
Ramirez says his son was raised on boxing, picking up numerous awards in the ring. When he died, he had 4 children with another on the way. And that's why Ramirez Sr. insists his son wouldn't have knowingly put himself in danger.
They need to be accountable for it. They need to let us know the truth, because that's what we're seeking, justice for my son.
In Southwest Bakersfield, Kiyoshi Tomono, 17 News.
The coroner says the autopsy report on Jorge Ramirez Jr. is not yet complete and could take several more weeks to complete. To take a look at the list of questions we submitted to the Bakersfield Police Department, you can visit our website, kget.com.
All right, thank you very much, Robert. 6:32. We want to update you on a story we continue to follow here from our newsroom. The BPD shooting and killing 2 men in the parking lot of the 4 Point Sheraton Hotel back in September. Police not answering a lot of questions, saying that it was still under investigation. Here's what we know. Officers shot and killed Jorge Ramirez Jr. and Justin Brian Harger. Harger was wanted for an assault with a deadly weapon, and officers say he was the one who pulled a gun on officers early that morning on September 17th. Ramirez's family is now asking whether Ramirez was a police informant who was leading officers to Harger through a deal that was brokered with the department. So here to answer that question now, Bakersfield Police Chief Greg Williamson. It is the topic of our 17 Newsmakers this morning. We did submit a list of 32 questions regarding the shooting last week. We were told the case was under investigation, and we understand it still is, but where's the investigation now? BPD Chief Greg Williamson, our guest in studio this morning. Chief, good morning to you.
Good morning. I don't know if I can get through all 32 here, but we'll do our best.
I know there's a lot of questions here, but let's start off first with one of the most pressing questions. Was Jorge Ramirez Jr. a police informant, and was he acting in any capacity for the department that early morning?
Mr. Ramirez did contact an officer of the Bakersfield Police Department and provide information as to Mr. Harger's whereabouts and where he would be on that evening. Problematic with the information that we got from Mr. Ramirez is that it was not complete. Mr. Ramirez could never give us an idea or be definitive if Mr. Harger was armed. We were very concerned about that. More problematic, he described the vehicle as a Jeep, which it was not a Jeep. It was some type of a foreign SUV. And in addition to that, he never disclosed to us that Mr. Harger was wearing a disguise, that of a wig. And as you've shown pictures before, and we've seen them in the newspaper, Mr. Harger is obviously bald.
So, Chief, break down for me, how does this work? If a person is an informant, and actually let me walk back, was he working in the capacity of an informant, leading officers to the 4-Point Sheridan that night to Harger?
He was. We had several correspondence with him. The officer who was speaking with him on the telephone passed this information on to the sergeant of the Special Enforcement Unit. They then rallied to make a plan and set up around the 4-Point Sheridan.
So, Chief, what measures were put in place in order to ensure Ramirez's safety, and what responsibility does the department have if they have an informant in the car in this case?
Well, I don't know that everybody was quite sure he was in the car. It was mentioned that we are going here and we are going there, but Mr. Harger never disclosed who was driving and who was the passenger. All of his phone calls were very hasty. We're going here, we're going here, we're going to be here. And so when officers came upon the car on that night, Officer Brewer was driving the black and white vehicle and put a spotlight into the passenger compartment. Officer Wimbish was the partner. Immediately, Mr. Ramirez exited the vehicle. The officers ordered him back into the vehicle. He refused. At that time, a altercation occurred on the passenger side of the vehicle, and both officers tried to contact Mr. Ramirez. It was at that time that Harger, either from inside the vehicle or just outside of the vehicle, shot Danny Brewer in the face. Danny Brewer retreated away from the vehicle, and Officer Wimbish took a point of advantage back to behind the patrol car. They exchanged gunfire for at least a minute or so before other officers were able to arrive.
So, Chief, how was Jorge Ramirez then killed? If he, as we understand, was not armed, was he shot accidentally, or did he make some kind of movement toward officers? Why was he shot?
Well, I think the problematic issue in this case is that Jorge Ramirez placed himself in this position. Officer Harger moved to the front of the car, and it's our understanding that Mr. Ramirez quite possibly moved to that area as well. We were responding to the flash and sound of gunfire and returning fire at the same time. So it's quite possible that Mr. Ramirez was shot at that time. More problematic at this point is our investigation is not complete, and we have not been able to talk to a few officers in regards to their actions on that night. Now, that may be problematic for the criminal side, but we have obviously received compelled statements from them on the administrative side, but those reports won't be ready for numerous weeks due to the additional shootings that we've had over the course of the last month or so.
And Chief, you're suggesting that some communication kind of failed in this case. Was there a failure on the department's behalf? Were some of the officers who were pulling over unaware that there was an informant in the car? Was that not communicated perhaps from the Special Enforcement Unit or from detectives? Well,
I think it was communicated. I think the intricacies are we didn't know if that was the right car. We didn't know that Harger was going to be wearing a wig, and obviously Mr. Ramirez is bald as well. With the lighting the way it is, it could be suspected that the officers thought that the passenger who immediately got out of the car was trying to flee and was possibly Mr. Harger. The officers in their state of mind quite possibly felt that, and we won't really know until the investigation is complete.
Obviously, the investigation ongoing, but you suspect will there be any changes with the program that you guys have with informants in the department as a result of this?
Well, there's numerous levels of informants. This individual was not a reliable informant. He was untested. He had worked on a separate case that never came to fruition. But we do give individuals who want to try to become informants with the police department the opportunity to show that they can be reliable.
And Chief, I want to ask also about the officers who were injured. How are they doing this morning?
Yeah, I wanted to say, and I wanted to start off the segment with that. I wanted to say, thanks to all the community for their support and thoughts and prayers, especially for Officer Brewer, who is recovering as well as he could be. I spoke with Danny last week briefly. Officer Wimbish is still off. He was injured not shot, but injured in the altercation as well. And so we want to thank the community for their outpouring and respect for those officers.
And Chief, we are running out of time, but I want to ask you, the Ramirez family was in the process of possibly seeking out representation by a lawyer. Do you think the BPD will face some legal ramifications, but possibly a lawsuit because of this? And do you think the department should hold some responsibility and should be responsible for what took place that night, given that there was an informant in the vehicle?
Well, I think that in any shooting case like this, we're going to face civil litigation. In addition, whether we face any culpability in the incident will remain to be seen as the investigation unfolds. Like I said, we're still probably a month away from completing.
Well, Chief, as I mentioned, we did have 32 questions, a lot of nuanced details of what took place that night. You kind of walked us through some of it. We appreciate you coming on our program this morning, and there are a lot of follow-up questions, but I appreciate you coming on and starting the conversation here on Sunrise.
Thanks for having me.
Good evening. Great to have you with us here at 5 o'clock. I'm Rochelle Murcia.
And I'm Kiyoshi Tomono. Tammy Milchok and Jim Scott have the night off. The Bakersfield Police Department shot and killed one of its own informants last month as he led them to a wanted parolee. But Chief Greg Williamson says informant Jorge Ramirez was providing inconsistent information to the department and failed to follow officers' orders during the traffic stop in the parking lot of the 4 Point Sheraton.
Its worst case scenario would happen in this instance.
What happened was the police shooting death of an informant who was leading officers to wanted parolee Justin Harger. And due to miscommunication, the officers may not have even known informant Jorge Ramirez was in the vehicle.
There was some assumption on the officer's part that he was in the car, but it wasn't totally clear to all of them that I'm aware of.
It was early in the morning of September 16th. Ramirez called his police handler, who was off duty at the time, and said he would help lead officers to Harger at the 4 Points Sheraton Hotel.
They need to be accountable for it. They need to let us know the truth.
The police chief says Harger and Ramirez pulled into a parking stall on the southeast side of the hotel after being pulled over by a black and white patrol car. The handler said Ramirez didn't specify on the phone if he was the driver or passenger and gave conflicting descriptions of what kind of vehicle he and Harger were traveling in.
He put himself in this situation. He could have very easily got out of the car, put his hands up, said, "I'm so-and-so," and put an end into that.
Though Ramirez was unarmed, officers said he got out of the vehicle and did not comply with their commands.
They ask him to get back in the car. They don't know who, they still don't know who he is. He turns around, makes furtive movements, puts his hands where they can't see them. They have to approach him.
That's when officers say Harger got out of the SUV and opened fire. Officer Daniel Brewer was hit by a graze wound to the temple, averting death by centimeters. Officer Rick Wimbish hurt his leg scrambling back to the patrol car. 3 additional officers responded and were told by Officer Wimbish that they were taking fire from behind the SUV. Those 3 officers returned fire. In the end, Harger and Ramirez were dead.
The officer who was handling Mr. Ramirez's information passed it on appropriately. He passed on all the information that he got. More problematic is that Ramirez didn't pass on all the information he had.
Ramirez's father maintains his son didn't deserve to die.
They might criticize his past. We all have a past. We all have friends or family members that have their past, troubled past.
Records show that criminal past included an open drug case following an arrest by the BPD in mid-August. Chief Williamson said Ramirez approached the department asking for leniency in that case, but none was immediately promised. Instead, he says informants must first be tested for reliability. And on the early morning of the shooting, the chief says Ramirez proved unreliable.
You know, he didn't tell us that Harger had a wig on, a disguise, and Harger is obviously a bald-headed man, so an officer looking through a window in a car and seeing hair would not believe that the driver would be Harger.
Chief Williamson said the SUV belonged to a woman who was staying at the hotel. He didn't identify her and couldn't specify why the men were headed there, but
both Harger and Ramirez had narcotics on their person.
The BPD is conducting an administrative and criminal review, which is customary in cases like this. Those investigations should be complete in about 3 weeks. In the meantime, the Ramirez family has hired famed attorney Mark Garagos. He told us by phone today, quote, "To me, it is fairly obvious that if the BPD uses citizens, they owe them some duty not to kill them. It is way too early," he said, to determine if a suit will be filed in this case. He says we're still conducting our investigation into why they put him there and why he was killed.